A Medal of Honor veteran was humiliated on a flight, treated like a nuisance by people who had no idea who he really was. 7 minutes later, the airline's president personally stepped into the cabin. No one understood what was happening until the veteran whispered a single sentence, and the entire plane fell silent. It started on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, somewhere between a worn-out gate in Dallas and a restless line of passengers eager to get airborne. Jack Reynolds, 76, leaned on his cane, wincing slightly with each step. He wasn't dressed to impress, just an old flannel shirt, jeans, and the kind of tired shoes that had walked through decades. To most people, he looked like someone's quiet grandpa, maybe lost, maybe confused. The trouble began before he even sat down. His seat, 22D, a cramped middle spot, required him to navigate past two impatient passengers who barely shifted their knees. When Jack asked as politely as possible if someone could help stow his cane, the woman in 22E rolled her eyes and muttered, "Unbelievable," under her breath. A man across the aisle chimed in with, "Maybe he's on the wrong flight." The murmurs built like static, buzzing in the background. A flight attendant stepped over with forced cheer. But when Jack struggled to explain that the cane was a medical necessity, her tone turned sharp. "Sir, you should have made arrangements beforehand. We can't delay boarding." Jack looked down, embarrassed, and mumbled, "Sorry, I didn't know." What happened next would make headlines, but in that moment, no one on board had any idea. They were part of a story much bigger than a delay or a disagreement. 7 minutes after Jack sat down, still holding his cane awkwardly, the entire atmosphere of the plane shifted. The door at the front opened once more, and a sharply dressed man in a navy suit entered the cabin, scanning the rows with intent. He didn't look like airport staff. He looked like someone important. Whispers rippled through the passengers. Why's he here?" The man didn't say a word, just walked straight to 22D, and then, kneeling beside the old man no one had respected, he asked a quiet question. Jack gave a small nod, leaned in, and whispered something back, and with that the cabin fell into total silence. Jack Reynolds had never liked flying, but today he didn't have much of a choice. His grandson was graduating college, the first in the family to do so, and missing that ceremony wasn't an option. Still, as he stepped onto the plane, every joint in his body protested. His right knee, rebuilt twice after a roadside blast in '68, throbbed worse than usual. The cane helped, but even that had seen better days. The rubber tip worn flat, the wood chipped near the handle. He walked with deliberate care down the narrow aisle, his eyes scanning for seat 22D. People behind him sighed loudly, irritated, at the slow pace. One young man in a hoodie muttered, "Jesus, come on," just loud enough for Jack to hear. He didn't respond. He was used to being invisible, at the grocery store, in waiting rooms, now here. Age has a way of making you fade. Seat 22D was a tight squeeze. Middle seat, back of the wing. Jack knew it would be a struggle. The woman in 22E didn't make it easier. She barely moved her handbag, choosing instead to look out the window with exaggerated disinterest. The man in 22C, earbuds in, barely acknowledged Jack's presence as he tried to pass his cane over their knees and slide into place. Jack managed a quiet, "Excuse me," but it floated into the air, unanswered. Sitting down took effort. His left hip always caught on something, and by the time he exhaled and set his cane across his lap, sweat had already formed along his brow. He glanced down at the floor, then up at the people around him. Everyone was scrolling, tapping, staring. Ahead, no one saw him. No one cared, but there was something about Jack Reynolds they didn't know, and in just a few minutes, that truth, hidden behind tired eyes and a weathered face, would crack the silence wide open. Just before takeoff, the man in 22C leaned. over with a fake smile and said, "Next time, old-timer, maybe get a wheelchair." Jack looked at him, dead in the eye, and said nothing. As the last few passengers boarded, the energy in the cabin shifted from impatience to irritation. Jack could feel it. The silent tapping of fingers on armrests, the subtle side eyes, from people wondering what was taking so long. He kept his gaze forward, hands resting over his cane like it was an anchor. The thing rattled with every movement, its worn shaft knocking gently against the metal seat post. He tried to tuck it under his feet, but the space was too tight. He adjusted it again and accidentally nudged the woman's foot beside him. She recoiled as if he'd burned her, then scoffed and muttered, "You people shouldn't even be allowed in the middle row." Jack turned his head slowly toward her. His voice, when it came, was low and even. "I'm sorry, Mom. Didn't mean to trouble you." She didn't answer. Instead, she flagged a flight attendant and said loudly, "Can someone do something about this? He's got a stick in the way. It's poking me." Jack offered the cane. "It's medical," he explained. "I had knee surgery. I can hold on to it." The flight attendant gave a quick, polite smile, but her eyes were tired. "Sir, we're really not supposed to have loose items during takeoff. Can you place it in the overhead bin?" Jack hesitated. He'd already tried earlier, but lifting it above his head with his shoulder the way it was, that wasn't going to happen. "I can't reach that high," he said quietly. Another passenger across the aisle rolled his eyes. "Just give it to someone, for God's sake." Then under his breath, "Shouldn't be flying if you can't handle it." The flight attendant sighed. "Do you want me to store it in the galley?" Her tone was clipped, professional, but lacking any warmth. Jack nodded slowly, holding it, out like a white flag. "Please, just don't lose it." As she walked away, he leaned back into the seat, exhaling through his nose. The familiar burn rose behind his eyes. Not from pain, not from embarrassment, from something deeper, something quieter. Once, a long time ago, men had moved aside when Jack walked into a room. They'd called him Sergeant. They'd followed his orders when bullets were flying. Now, no one even wanted to give him legroom. The man in 22C leaned toward him again and smirked. "Next time, old-timer, maybe get a wheelchair." Jack didn't blink. He looked at him, not with anger, not even sadness, but with the tired patience of a man who had seen far worse. Then he said nothing at all. The engines had begun their low rumble as the final announcements buzzed through the speakers. Passengers fumbled with seatbelts, silenced their phones, adjusted air vents. Jack sat still, hands now folded over his lap, eyes unfocused. He could feel the woman beside him shifting away slightly, as if his very presence made her uncomfortable. The attendant returned with his cane. Not to return it, but to double-check something. "Sir, I need to verify that your item is properly secured in the galley," she said briskly. "You can't have it back until we're in the air." Jack nodded. "That's fine, thank you for handling it." But something about his tone, calm but tinged with exhaustion, seemed to strike. "The wrong chord," she pursed her lips. "Look, I understand it's inconvenient, but you should have told the gate staff about your needs ahead of time. We have protocols for these things. We're on a tight schedule." "I didn't realize it'd be a problem," he said, his voice steady. She gave a tight nod and turned to walk away, but then paused, clearly irritated. "Honestly, sir, if you need that much assistance boarding, maybe you should consider special services next time. You held up the entire line." The words weren't shouted. They weren't cruel, but they were loud enough. Loud enough that the man in 22C chuckled. Loud enough that the teenager across the aisle snorted. Loud enough that Jack's face went still, like a man trained to withstand pressure, now holding in something far heavier than shame. He looked straight ahead, his lips pressed into a line. He didn't defend himself. He didn't explain. He just nodded, not out of agreement but resignation. The flight attendant walked away briskly, adjusting her vest as she disappeared into the front of the plane, and then, somewhere up in the First-class galley, a different voice entered the conversation. It was another flight attendant, younger, more observant. She had watched the entire exchange from a few rows up. Without a word, she lifted her comm device, pressed a discreet button, and whispered something into her mic. Then she looked back toward 22D. And for the first time since Jack boarded, someone truly saw him. Lauren Brooks had only been working as a flight attendant for a year, but she'd already learned how to read people, who was nervous, who was impatient, who just wanted their headphones and a drink. But the man in 22D was different. He wasn't complaining, wasn't loud, wasn't entitled. He was just carrying something heavier than a cane. From her post near the front, she'd watched the small, painful scene unfold, the annoyed glances, the rolled eyes, the sharp tone. From her colleague, she'd seen Jack's face go still, like someone retreating inward, not offended, not angry, just tired of being misunderstood. She didn't know his story, not yet. But something told her this man deserved more than silence. Lauren's fingers hovered over her radio. This wasn't protocol, not by the book. You didn't call up senior staff unless there was a real issue. Medical, mechanical, safety. But something about the way he'd said, "It's all I've got," when handing over his cane had stayed with her. Not the words exactly. The way he said them, like he wasn't talking about a piece of wood at all. She tapped her comm. "Hey," she whispered, barely audible. "Can you check if Mr. Hampton is still in the terminal? Tell him there's a passenger in seat 22D who might need to be seen." There was a pause. The voice on the other end asked, confused, "What kind of issue?" Lauren hesitated. "Not the usual kind," she said quietly. She turned around, her eyes drifting back toward row 22. Jack was sitting upright, hands folded, expression unreadable. The other flight attendant was now laughing with a passenger near the galley, unaware of what had been set in motion. The cabin lights dimmed in preparation for takeoff. The hum of engines grew louder, but Lauren's heartbeat was louder still. She didn't know what exactly would happen, only that someone needed to step in, and less than 7 minutes later, someone did. It had been just under 7 minutes since Lauren made the call. Jack didn't notice the time pass. He sat motionless, like a figure carved from something older than wood or stone. Around him, the cabin buzzed with its usual low chorus. Carry-ons thumping into overhead bins, a crying toddler 2 rows up, the flight crew giving final checks. Then, without warning, the cabin door opened again. It wasn't supposed to. Everyone assumed boarding was done, but in walked a tall man in a navy suit, the kind that clearly hadn't come off a rack at the mall. He didn't carry luggage. He didn't glance at the manifest. His stride was calm but purposeful, his face unreadable. Passengers turned to look. A few whispered, confused. One man near the front leaned into the aisle and asked quietly, "Is that the airline guy?" The suited man nodded briefly to a flight attendant near the galley, who stepped aside with a hushed, "Right this way, sir." He didn't stop at first class. He walked the narrow aisle like it belonged to him, eyes scanning the row numbers as if seeking out a very specific destination. And then he reached row 22. Everyone nearby went still. The murmur of casual conversation dried up like a faucet turned tight. The man looked down at Jack Reynolds, seated in the middle, hands still folded. "Mr. Reynolds?" the suited man asked. Jack turned slowly. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Yes." The man dropped to one knee, a gesture that felt both strange and reverent in the cramped space. He leaned in, speaking so quietly no one could hear what he asked. Jack listened, then nodded once, and then he whispered something back. Whatever it wasn't loud, but it moved like a shockwave through the air. The executive's eyes widened, and not in fear, but in recognition. He stood up slowly, cleared his throat, and looked around at the watching passengers. Silence. You could hear the engine noise outside. You could hear the blinking of the exit signs, but no one inside the plane made a sound. Jack didn't move. He didn't smile. He simply turned his face back toward the window and stared out, as if the clouds beyond held something only he understood. Fesaitia, cabin remained hushed, thick with a silence that didn't feel accidental. People shifted in their seats, exchanging glances, trying to piece together what they'd just witnessed. The kneeling, the whisper, the stunned look on the executive's face. But Jack Reynolds, he didn't seem moved at all. He simply stared. Out the window, calm as glass, like none of it mattered anymore. Only his hands gave him away. One of them, the right, rested palm down against his thigh, trembling just slightly. Not from weakness, but memory. His thumb brushed the scar along the base of his hand, faded now, more texture than wound. A mark left by shrapnel decades earlier. He could still see it, like it had happened yesterday. The jungle, the deafening gunfire, the impossible decision. His squad was surrounded. Communications were down. He had 2 wounded boys, 19, maybe 20. Jack had dragged one through the thick brush himself, firing blind with his sidearm, his arm burning from a fresh gash. He didn't remember the pain. He remembered their faces. He'd gone back for the second boy against orders. He never told anyone that part, not even his wife, back when she was alive. That second boy had survived, became a father, sent Jack. A photo of his daughter's wedding just last year. A Medal of Honor came later, pinned to his chest by a president who looked him in the eye and called him a hero. But heroes, Jack knew, didn't walk onto planes with medals on their chests. They limped in quietly. They sat in seat 22D and tried not to trouble anyone with a cane. He blinked slowly, pulling himself back into the present. The airline president had stepped away now, speaking with the flight crew in hushed tones. The woman in 22E sat rigid, her mouth slightly open. She didn't look at Jack. Neither did anyone else. Not yet. Jack shifted slightly in his seat. The scar on his hand caught the light, a flash of silver against age-spotted skin. Most people wouldn't notice it, but if they had, they'd have. Realized that some stories aren't written in words, they're etched in flesh. The airline president returned to row 22, slower this time, his face composed but pale. He leaned in again toward Jack and asked, barely audible to the closest rows, "Sir, may I ask what you said?" Jack looked up, eyes calm but sharp. "I told you the date," he said simply. That was it. But for the man in the suit, that date meant everything. It was the same one carved into a wall at Arlington, the same one recited in military ceremonies. A day of loss, but also of courage. Jack didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. His name, his record, and that one whispered date had already spoken volumes. The president stood up straighter. He turned toward the front of the cabin, his voice clear now but respectful. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his tone cutting gently through the quiet, "we have a guest on board who deserves more than a seat and a snack tray." He didn't mention Jack's name. He didn't say Medal of Honor. He didn't need. Word began to ripple through the rows, not from the president, but from a young man a few seats back, eyes wide, phone clutched in his hand. "That's Jack Reynolds," he whispered to the woman beside him. "Vietnam, Firebase Echo. He pulled 3 guys out under fire. I saw a documentary about him once." People started to shift, slowly at first. The woman in 22E blinked as if waking from a long nap. She looked at Jack differently now, her lips parted like she wanted to speak, but had forgotten how. The man in 22C, the one who had mocked him, removed his earbuds and looked down at the floor. And Jack? He didn't bask in the silence or the recognition. He just closed his eyes for a moment, as if the weight he'd been carrying had suddenly grown a little lighter, not because people finally knew who he was, but because he no longer had to carry it alone. The cabin had gone from restless to reverent. It wasn't silence out of confusion anymore. It was a hush made of realization. The kind that settles over people when they know they've misjudged someone and there's no excuse to cling to. Passengers sat straighter, eyes darting toward Jack, then away. Some looked ashamed, others curious. A few, especially those old enough to remember headlines from Vietnam, simply looked stunned, not because Jack Reynolds had once been heroic, but because they'd all overlooked him entirely. Then, slowly, something began to happen. A woman in her 60s, a row behind. Jack unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her voice was clear. "Sir," she said softly, "thank you for everything you've done." Jack looked up. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, both of them seemed to exist in their own quiet space. She reached across the aisle, not for words, but for contact, placing her hand gently on his shoulder. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it felt like a salute. One by one, others followed. A man near the emergency exit leaned forward to catch Jack's eye and gave a solemn nod. A teenager 3 rows up put away his phone, suddenly unsure of what he'd been recording. Even the flight attendant, the one who had scolded Jack earlier, now stood near the front, her face drained of its authority. She looked like someone who had been handed a mirror and didn't like what she saw. Lauren, the younger attendant, approached again, this time holding something in her hand. It wasn't much. A small set of golden Airline wings, the kind they usually gave to kids on their first flight. But her voice shook as she spoke. "It's not official," she said, placing it carefully in Jack's palm. "But it's from all of us." Jack stared at it for a long second. Then, without a word, he tucked the pin into his shirt pocket, right next to the scar, because sometimes respect doesn't come from ceremony. It comes from small gestures in unexpected places, and every person on that flight, from the woman who rolled her eyes to the CEO in polished shoes, would never forget that. The plane touched down in Seattle just after sunset, the sky painted in streaks of lavender and gold. Passengers gathered their belongings with more care than usual, casting glances toward 22D as if reluctant to leave. No one pushed ahead. No one muttered complaints about delays. Jack waited until nearly everyone had deboarded before rising from his seat. His cane had been returned to him gently, this time by the same attendant who'd snapped at him earlier. She didn't say much, just held it out with both hands and a softened expression. Jack accepted it with a nod, offering no judgment, only grace. He walked slowly through the terminal, the rolling ache in his knee familiar but no longer a burden. His daughter was meeting him at baggage claim, but he found himself drawn to a quieter corner near the large windows overlooking the tarmac. From his coat pocket, he pulled out a small notepad. The pages were wrinkled, the pen he used slightly dry, but the words came anyway. "To those who fly, serve, or simply watch from the sidelines," he wrote, "you never truly know the weight someone carries. Scars don't always show. Heroism doesn't. Wear a name tag. And dignity should never require explanation." He paused, then added, "If you ever find yourself tempted to dismiss the quiet one, the slow one, the old one, remember this. Every person carries an invisible flag. Some just fold theirs a little tighter than others." He signed his name simply Jack R. and closed the notebook. Just as he turned to go, a young airport staffer jogged up, slightly out of breath. "Sir," he said, holding up a phone, "someone on the flight posted a photo, said you whispered something that stopped the whole plane. Everyone's talking about it. Do you want to say what you said?" Jack smiled faintly, eyes tired but warm. "No," he said, "I already did." And then he walked toward the baggage claim, cane clicking softly, medal tucked deep in his pocket, and a plane full of strangers forever changed behind him. If this story moved you even a little, we'd love for you to be part of our community. Where are you watching from? And what part of Jack's journey stayed with you the most? Tap subscribe, leave a comment, and share your thoughts. You never know. Your words might be the whisper someone else needs.